Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I am speaking with Dr. Michael Edelstein about why self-esteem is an unreasonable concept. Dr. Edelstein is a clinical psychologist and the co-author of 3-Minute Therapy, Change Your Thinking, Change Your Life. He is also a co-author of Therapy Breakthrough, Why Some Psychotherapies Work Better Than Others, Stage Fright, 40 Stars Tell You How They Beat America's Number One Fear, and Rational Drinking, How to Live Happily With or Without Alcohol. He will be speaking this upcoming Sunday, July 31st, at the Capitalism and Morality Conference and the Sons of Anarchy Conference in Vancouver. You can follow his work at 3minutetherapy.com. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/self-esteem. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Adam. It's good to be here and speak with you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you. So let's start with a very basic question, but it seems very critical to establish this foundation before we can get into other topics. So let's just start off with a very basic definition of what self-esteem is.
Okay, that's a good way to start. And to esteem something means to think highly of it. So self-esteem means to think highly of oneself.
Okay, so where did this concept come from and how did it originate?
That's another good question, and I'm not really sure where it came from. It's been around for a long time, and it's been popularized, as far as I can tell, in the 80s and 90s in books, school curricula, and in therapy offices. Therapists buy into this concept of self-esteem. They think it's a great idea to teach their clients high self-esteem. And I have a moderate view on this. I think the idea of self-esteem is unempirical, illogical, and unpragmatic. Otherwise, I love it.
So why do proponents of self-esteem promote this concept? Why do they claim that it's so important and valuable to teach the importance of self-esteem and especially the importance of a high self-esteem?
I think the reason is that when people come in for therapy and they're depressed or anxious, often the therapist rightly diagnoses their problem as low self-esteem. They think very poorly of themselves. The clients do, and the reason the clients think poorly of themselves is because they think they're doing poorly in the world in terms of achieving what they'd like to achieve, or they're doing poorly with people in terms of getting the kind of approval, love, relationships that they'd like to have. So they think, well, this proves I'm a loser, I'm no good, I'm less of a person. They give themselves low self-esteem. They put themselves down. So I think it's sort of natural or intuitive to say, well, if your problem is low self-esteem, then the solution is high self-esteem. Think highly of yourself. You're not such a bad person. In fact, you're a good person. You mean well. You help people. You're moral, so you're a good person. So that seems to be a natural tendency and perhaps why the idea of self-esteem is so popular.
So how does this play out in relation to productivity? Is there any evidence to suggest that high self-esteem leads to higher productivity? Is it the opposite? What conclusions can we draw about that?
I think the studies are not that conclusive, and they're not often very good studies, but there have been studies which show that when cigarette smokers think well of themselves and they think they'll have no problem giving up smoking, then they do more poorly than people who don't have self-esteem. There was a very famous study done with high school students. There were students from various countries, which included the U.S., Britain, Ireland, Korea, and they were given 2 tests. One was a math test, and the other was just a questionnaire I am good at math, yes or no. And the interesting thing was the Koreans came out first on the math test, and the U.S. students came out last on the math test, but they came out first on thinking, I am good at math. And the reason given for this is that they were subjected to the self-esteem curriculum, where they learned to think well of themselves no matter what, and it was very unrealistic. And one of the problems with high self-esteem is if you're a good person, why try hard? Why work conscientiously? Because you're good. You're God's gift to the human race. So there's no reason to face challenges and risk failure. So they weren't as conscientious in studying for the exams, and they did poorly.
Right, yeah, it seems that with a high self-esteem could come complacency and a feeling that a strong work ethic is not quite as necessary.
Yes, that's one of the findings.
All right, so you mentioned the self-esteem curriculum. Can you flesh out exactly what you mean by that and some of the ways that we see this concept taught in the public schools?
I think that the way it's taught is basically to tell people that they're good. Maybe you did poorly on this test, but you're still a good person. And sometimes it might be tied to different things. You care about your fellow classmates, or you're moral, or those kinds of things. You tried hard. But sometimes it just seems like you're good just because you're you. So that's another perspective on it. So those things are discussed and taught and reinforced in some school curricula.
Right. It almost becomes more about how you feel than what you actually accomplish and are capable of accomplishing.
That's right. Although I think both are an error. That I think it's an error to base self-esteem on how you feel. It's an error to base self-esteem on what you accomplish. That it doesn't work and it doesn't follow logically, and there's no data to show that you're a good person when you do well. There's data to show you do well in terms of certain goals. If you win the race, you did well, but that doesn't magically transform you into a good or wonderful person. You're still the same imperfect human you were before you ran the race.
Right. So I want to return to the connection between productivity and self-esteem. It seems like there have been many people throughout history who have been very successful, who have been geniuses and gifted far beyond that of most people, and yet they suffered from low self-esteem, they suffered from depression, anxiety. What has your research shown about that sort of thing, and can you give some examples of people who would fall into that category?
Yes, that's a good question. And just as you say, there were many people throughout history who were quite accomplished and had low self-esteem. One example is Leonardo da Vinci, who painted works of genius, but he was frequently depressed. He got angry easily. He fought with his patrons. Because of his depression, most particularly, that indicates he had low self-esteem. You get depressed by thinking poorly of yourself, yet he produced works of genius. Ludwig van Beethoven had suicidal ideation before he wrote the Third Symphony, and which was a brilliant symphony, one of his best. And he was depressed, he had mood swings, he had difficulty getting along with people, yet he did quite well in his life. Charles Darwin, the brilliant naturalist, had severe depression. He went for long periods of time without producing anything. He had panic attacks, agoraphobia. He had those psychological problems which are almost always tied with low self-esteem. Yet his works have endured and been strengthened throughout the years. Then, most notably, and interesting for libertarians, is Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand, who touted high self-esteem, was addicted to nicotine and dexedrine and caffeine. She was offensive to many people. She wanted to be friends with the famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright and had a few meetings with him, but then he would have nothing to do with her because he found her too obnoxious and off-putting. Then in 1974, she had surgery with lung cancer, and apparently she was ashamed of that because she told her inner circle, she instructed them, don't tell anyone that I had surgery for lung cancer. She continued smoking 2 packs a day and then died 8 years later. She praised smoking in her novels also. So she was very productive in some ways in her life. She produced some, in my view, some great novels and had an interesting philosophical perspective that she wrote about, and her politics was quite good compared to others, yet she did quite poorly in many areas of her life. So those would be some examples.
Sure. So how do proponents of the self-esteem concept explain away these examples?
That's a good question. And I think the way they do it is the way Nathaniel Branden does it. And Nathaniel Branden was the main acolyte of Ayn Rand, who wrote about self-esteem. He's written volumes on self-esteem. And the way he explains it is that he says there are 2 kinds of self-esteem. One kind is inauthentic self-esteem, where you tie your self-esteem to the wrong things, and then there's authentic self-esteem. And these people had inauthentic self-esteem, and the thing to tie your self-esteem to is the following, which he elaborates on in a number of his books, in particular his book called The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem. And he says you get self-esteem when you live consciously, you have self-acceptance, you act responsibly, you act assertively, you live purposefully, and you have personal integrity. And so if you have authentic self-esteem, then you do well in your life. But these people who don't do well in their life, if they have self-esteem, it's inauthentic. Now, let me take a step back, Adam, and tell you a little more about the basic concept of self-esteem.
Sure.
Self-esteem comes from self-rating, rating your total self based on how well you do in areas of your life. So in these 6 pillars of self-esteem, Nathaniel Branden is listing some very important things to do well in life, to live consciously and to be assertive, live purposefully, have personal integrity. So those are very good, but then he makes the major leap from doing well at these things to then you're a good person. You should have self-esteem. Actually, he doesn't say you should have self-esteem. He says self-esteem springs from doing well at these things. But self-esteem, feeling good about yourself or bad about yourself, is an emotion. It's a feeling. And feelings come from our thinking. They don't come from situations. So in order to have a feeling of high or low self-esteem, it means some cognition comes in between what you do, say you have personal integrity, and your self-esteem. So you say to yourself, well, I have personal integrity. That makes me a good person. That's the evaluation. That makes me a good person. And that evaluation gives you high self-esteem. It doesn't spring from the act of personal integrity. It springs from how you evaluate that act. And the evaluation is false because you're rating your total self based on what you do. There's no evidence that you become a good person, you're any different than you were before you acted with integrity. It doesn't follow logically that your acts equal you, and it's unpragmatic. It doesn't work because there are many problems with having high self-esteem, and I mentioned a few. And one is you tend to feel like you're better than others. because you're a good person, and here are these others who are screwing up in their lives, and that leads to not getting along well with people, not connecting with people, and also not looking at your errors and trying to do better, because if you admitted you make errors, then you go back to low self-esteem.
So what do proponents of the self-esteem concept say about the connection between self-esteem and criminals? Because it seems like the conventional narrative would be that criminals have low self-esteem, and yet you could view it based on the value system that likely goes along with a hardened criminal and say that these people are attempting to commit these crimes, and if they're successful, then that should in turn bring about a high self-esteem. So what do they say about that connection, and where are they wrong?
Well, they're wrong because there's a lot of evidence that criminals often have high self-esteem, partly because of what you say, Adam. If they're successful at the crime, then they rate themselves based on the rating of their behavior, but also they generally think, because they have high self-esteem, they generally think they deserve whatever you have because they're such wonderful people, so they're right in stealing from you or taking from you, so they tend to be self-righteous. And then even if they do poorly, they don't say, now I'm a bad person. Normally they continue to have high self-esteem and think, well, I just screwed up this time, but I deserve it, so I'll try again and again and again till they get caught, if they get caught. Now, again, the response from the self-esteem movement is they have inauthentic self-esteem. It's not based on these 6 pillars of self-esteem that Nathaniel Branden talks about, such as living consciously and having a purpose in life, etc.
Okay, so I want to turn to a couple of political related topics that tie back into self-esteem. And one thing I've heard you say elsewhere in other interviews is that self-esteem encourages nationalism. And with the Olympics coming up next month and with the presidential election that's currently going on right now, that seems like an especially appropriate topic to bring up. So how does self-esteem encourage nationalism? And is this something that self-esteem promoters pick up on, or is this a concept that they ignore and don't pay attention to?
I haven't seen them pick up on that, and I haven't seen other writers against self-esteem mention the nationalistic aspect of it, but people tend to identify with their group. And you see this in sports, in baseball or basketball, or especially in soccer in Europe, where fights break out and there's much more violence in their fans, that they identify themselves with their team. So the team is me and I am the team. So if the team does well, I'm a good person. If the team does poorly, I'm not. And the way that works with nationalism is people who live in a particular country think that that country and that government is their team. So it's great when their country, by which they really mean the government, but they don't realize that, takes over the world and becomes policeman of the world and spreads their political system to other countries. That's great, and that makes them great, since there's a one-to-one correspondence in their mind between their country, their government, and themselves. So I think that's the way it encourages nationalism. And as we know, nationalism is a very, very dangerous philosophy and leads to wars and carnage. And if people gave up the whole self-esteem idea, then they would see that their government and they are separate. They have the misfortune to be governed by this government, and the government is not on their side or part of them at all.
Right, and it's obviously on a completely different level to have someone cheer on the local sports team in their town or city and feel good when they're successful, as versus cheering on aggressive military action by people who are from the same general area or the same country as you. Obviously, those are on different levels, but I guess the principles and concepts underlying those two things are basically the same.
Yes, there is a vast difference, a universe of difference, and the principles underlying it, as you correctly say, are the same. And the same principle is rating your total self based on your behavior. And that's the big error. The evaluation of your behavior, I did well on the exam, is not the evaluation of you. And there's no point in making that overgeneralization. It doesn't help. It tends to make life worse for you in the long run, but it feels good for the moment. And as we know, people go for the quick fix, feeling good for the moment, and they often forget about the long term.
All right, so one other political concept I want to bring into this, and that's the notion of egalitarianism. In what ways is there a connection between the self-esteem movement and egalitarianism, and what are some of the ways we've seen people who believe in an egalitarian ideology taking advantage of that concept?
Well, I think that the idea of self-esteem blurs the differences between people, except in a very superficial way, in the idea of diversity of races rather than the diversity of ideas. And so you're good, I'm good, we're all good, so we're all good people, so we're all equal, and therefore we should all have not only equal opportunities but equal outcomes because we're all good people. And then that leads to a lot of unfortunate laws that squelch people's differences and squelch some people from excelling. And when they excel, they often help the rest of us, which is missed. So self-esteem, I think, plays a part in this egalitarianism.
All right, so before we wrap up, I want to look at some alternatives, and I want to look at your personal experiences. So let's start there. How have your experiences as a clinical psychologist influenced your views on self-esteem? What were your views like when you went to school for this, and how have your experiences in that profession changed the way you look at the self-esteem concept?
Well, when I first got interested in being a clinical psychologist, when I was in college, before I went to graduate school, my first major influence was Albert Ellis, who was a pioneer in the field of psychology and started the type of therapy that I do, which is called rational emotive behavior therapy. And from the very beginning, he was teaching the idea that self-esteem is toxic. And the solution, the alternative to self-esteem, is unconditional self-acceptance. Accepting yourself unconditionally, whether you do well or poorly, or people like you or dislike you, you're still the same imperfect human all the way through. So I really got an early start on unconditional self-acceptance versus self-esteem. And in my work with clients, often this is one of their major problems, self-rating, rating themselves. Now, there are other problems unrelated to self-esteem. Some therapists think everything goes back to self-esteem, addictions, whatever it is, goes back to self-esteem, but that's wrong. There are three areas of problems that people have. One is in the area of doing well and getting approval. And people have a goal, most people have a goal in their life to do well in their life and get approval, but then they make it into a demand, a must. I absolutely must do well and get approval in my life, and if I don't, I'm no good, I'm a failure, I'm a worthless person. And that's where self-esteem comes in, from this demand on oneself. I absolutely must do well and get approval. But there are two other areas unrelated to self-esteem. The second, it leads to anger, resentment, and hostility, and that takes the form of, because I prefer others treat me well, fairly, reasonably, lovingly, courteously, kindly, reciprocally, rationally, therefore they absolutely must, they have to, And if they don't, they're no good. They're rotten people. They deserve to roast in hell. And I've appointed myself their roaster. And that leads to various types of anger and bitterness, murder, those kinds of things. Then the third area of disturbance and where people operate in their lives is the impersonal conditions of one's life. It's not connected to others or themselves, but connected to conditions. And in terms of one's thinking, that takes a form of, because I prefer life to be fair, easy, and hassle-free, it absolutely must, it has to be, and if it's not, I'll be miserable forever. I can't stand it, so I'll escape in drugs, alcohol, or I'll procrastinate and put things off forever because it's too uncomfortable. So those are various areas unrelated. The last two are unrelated to self-esteem, but in terms of self-esteem, it comes from the first must. I must do well and get approval, and if I don't, I'm no good. And I've seen that in my clients in the almost 40 years I've been doing therapy, that self-esteem is a major problem for people, along with the other two.
All right, so can you explain in a little more detail what unconditional self-acceptance is, what you mean by that concept? And then are there any other major alternatives to the self-esteem concept that you have not laid out so far?
Okay, yes. So unconditional self-acceptance in more detail is recognizing, especially that at times you do poorly or people don't like you, acknowledging it, this is the reality, facing the reality, and seeing that it's bad, it's not good if you do poorly, and then, but then adding that there's no reason it should not exist. If I do poorly, I do poorly. That's the way it goes. I can try to do better next time, rather than the self-esteem idea, which is I should do well, and if I do well, I'm a good person. And seeing that it's not awful, terrible, or horrible to do poorly. It's unfortunate, it's very disadvantageous, or very, very disadvantageous and convenient, but not horrible, terrible, and awful. So self-acceptance has all those elements in it. Then you asked another question in there, Adam. What was that?
Yes. Other alternatives to the self-esteem concept that you have not laid out thus far.
Yes, that's a good question. And so the alternative I laid out was unconditional self-acceptance. But there are other alternatives which I don't think are as good, but might be better than high and low self-esteem. And one is unconditional, not self-acceptance, but high self-esteem, where you think, I'm okay as a person, whether I do well or poorly, I'm still okay. And then you don't get depressed. You may not be as effective in your life if you believe that, but at least you're not going to make yourself depressed. Another alternative is the religious one, that I'm okay because God loves me. So again, if it's unconditional, which often it's not, because God's not going to love you, obviously, if you disobey the Ten Commandments or other things, but that's another attempt at an alternative to what I think is the most elegant alternative, the unconditional self-acceptance, accepting yourself as an imperfect human.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for joining me today. This is a very interesting topic, and I think most people just sort of take the whole self-esteem concept for granted. So I'm glad that we were able to go through some alternative theories and point out some issues with that concept. For someone who wants to learn more about the self-esteem concept, unconditional self-acceptance, and related topics, what resources and readings do you recommend they take a look at?
I recommend my website, first of all, which points you to other resources, 3minutetherapy.com, and 3 is spelled out. 3-Minute Therapy is all one word, and it's the name of my book. And I recommend reading my book, 3-Minute Therapy. It's available on Amazon and Kindle. And I mentioned Albert Ellis, the founder of this approach. He's written over 80 books. So if you go to Amazon or you go to YouTube and put in Albert Ellis, E-L-L-I-S, you'll find out a lot more about this approach. Also, I have many YouTubes as well. And I also have a phone and Skype therapy practice in addition to in-person therapy. So if you're interested in asking me a question or talking about an appointment, feel free to contact me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. On my website is my email address and my phone number, so be happy to speak with you. Thanks, Adam.
Okay, sure. And at the beginning of the interview, I mentioned the best ways to follow your work as well as some conferences that you'll be speaking at coming up this weekend. So can you briefly discuss what will be happening at those conferences, what you'll be discussing, along with the best ways to follow your work? Of course, you mentioned 3minutetherapy.com in there, but feel free to talk a little bit more about your website as well.
Yeah, about the conferences you mean. The first conference on Sunday will be Capitalism and Morality 2016, and there's a website for that with the schedule. In addition to me, Walter Block will be speaking, Doug Casey will be speaking, Butler Schaefer, Rick Rule, and others. It's a 2-day conference, a Saturday and Sunday conference. I'll be on Sunday. And then the other conference, also in Vancouver, is Sons of Anarchy. Walter Block will be speaking there also. That'll be in the evening nearby. And they have a website also.
Okay, great. Yeah, those sound like excellent events. So I look forward to at least being able to check out the YouTube videos of the various speeches. And I want to thank you for joining me today. Of course, the show notes page for this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/self-esteem. And that's the place to go for this episode. There'll be a link to 3minutetherapy.com, links to those conferences, some Albert Ellis-related resources, and, of course, links to all of your books. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/self-esteem is the place to go. And I want to encourage everybody to sign up for the email list while they're on the website so that they can stay up to date with the show that way, as well as to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher to make sure you never miss an episode. And Michael, thank you so much for joining me today. This topic is a little out of the norm for the sorts of things that are usually discussed on this show, but it's a very interesting topic, and there are definitely some things that you brought up today that I hadn't considered before, and I'm sure that's the case for those listening as well. So thanks so much to walk us through this topic and explain where some of the pitfalls are.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for an interesting interview and great questions. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you, and hopefully we can speak again in the future.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.